Welcome to a deep dive into the world of data privacy. We're taking a close look at Opinion 1220-2024 from the European Data Protection Board. We know you care about this stuff, so we're here to help you figure out what it means for you.
Yeah, it's a bit of a tough read, but basically, the EDPB is trying to make it clear that data controllers are accountable, even when they're not the ones actually processing the data.
Okay, so let's say you've got a data processor you're working with. You think you've done your homework, right? But then what about their sub-processors and
Okay.
their sub-sub-processors? It's like a chain, right?
Exactly. And this opinion is very, very clear. You need to know everyone in that data processing chain, the whole team.
You mean like names and addresses, that kind of thing? The whole nine yards?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And this isn't just about checking a box on a form. It's about transparency for your users.
Yeah.
The people whose data is being processed, they have a right to know who can see their information, even if it's 5 steps removed from that first company.
Right. But that applies even if it's something low risk, like that's just basic analytics or something.
You know, the level of scrutiny, it has to match how sensitive the data is. That's true.
Yeah.
But even when it's low risk, the EDPB is really emphasizing that you at least need to be aware and in control. You've got to be able to show that you didn't just hand over the data without thinking about it.
Okay, so transparency is important, but then there's this idea of sufficient guarantees that keeps coming up. What does that actually mean here?
Imagine you're hiring someone to renovate your kitchen.
Right.
You wouldn't just give them your keys and hope for the best. You'd want to see their credentials, maybe check some references, understand their process. Sufficient guarantees, it's kind of the same thing, but for data processing.
So it's not enough for your processor to just say, yeah, we handle everything responsibly. You actually need to see it, like in their security protocols or their track record.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And that goes for every single part of the chain.
Hmm.
Your processor, their sub-processors, you're the one who is ultimately responsible for the data you collect, even when it's in someone else's hands.
That's a lot of responsibility. So how do you actually make sure those sufficient guarantees are real? Are we talking like a full audit for every single vendor?
Well, the opinion is smart about this.
Mm.
It doesn't say there's only one way to do it, and for good reason. How closely you look should always depend on the risk.
So lower risk data may be less intensive, but with high risk data, you need to be much more careful.
Exactly. Think of it like a scale. The EDPD gives some good practical examples of what this could look like. So maybe for low-risk processing, you send out a detailed questionnaire, or you review their documentation. But for high risk, then you might want specific certifications, an independent audit, or even go visit them yourself.
So it's about understanding what could happen if something goes wrong and then taking the right steps to stop that from happening.
Yes, and this is key. Write everything down. Document it. You need to be able to prove that you did your due diligence, because if you can't, it's like it never happened.
Right. It's not just about doing the right thing. It's about being able to prove it if you need to. So let's talk about those sub-processing contracts. If my processor is using, say, a cloud storage provider, should I be asking to see that agreement?
That's a really good question. The EDPB doesn't say you always have to do that,
Hmm.
but they do say it's important, especially when you're dealing with high-risk processing.
So it depends on the situation.
Exactly. Let's say you're a healthcare provider. You're working with really sensitive data. It makes sense that you'd want to know exactly how your processors, sub-processors are handling that data. But if it's just basic website analytics with not a lot of personal data, then maybe you don't need to do a deep dive on all those sub-processor contracts.
So communication is important here. Your data processors, the good ones at least, they should be telling you about their sub-processors without you even having to ask, and telling you about their security measures.
100%. It's about trust, for sure. But you should be able to verify that trust, too. Don't be afraid to ask questions. Ask for proof. And make sure you're okay with how they're handling your data at every single stage.
Trust but verify. I like that.
And remember, this isn't something you do once and then forget about it. Data privacy is a process. You need to keep learning about any changes, review your safeguards, and change what you do to adapt.
So it's about building a whole culture of data protection, not just ticking boxes on a checklist.
You got it. And that's something the EDPB is clearly pushing for with this opinion.
Now, things get even more interesting when we start talking about data crossing borders. So we've talked about knowing who's processing your data, making sure those sufficient guarantees are in place. But what about when that data goes international? That's got to be a whole other can of worms.
Yeah, you're right. International data transfers definitely add another layer, that's for sure. And those sufficient guarantees we talked about, they're even more important when data leaves the EU.
Because now you're trusting your processor to follow someone else's rules, not just what the EU says.
Right. Exactly. And the opinion is very clear on this point. It's ultimately on you, the data controller. You have to understand the laws of the country where that data is going,
Yeah.
even if it's your processor or subprocessor who's actually doing the transferring.
Okay, so let's say I'm working with, I don't know, a marketing platform, and they're based in the US. Does that mean I need to become a legal expert on US data protection?
Well, you don't have to be an expert, but you do need to know the basics. Like, does that country protect data in the same way the GDPR does? Are there any special rules you need to know about?
That sounds like a lot,
Yeah.
especially for smaller companies that might not have, like, a legal team. What are you supposed to even do?
Well, the opinion talks about these transfer impact assessments. It's kind of like, imagine you're shipping something fragile across the ocean. You'd pack it really carefully, right? Choose the right shipper, and you'd probably track it the whole way. A transfer impact assessment is kind of like that, but for data.
So you're looking at the possible risks for that data while it's being sent somewhere else.
Exactly. What data is it? Where is it going? Who's going to see it? And, really important, are the laws in that other country strong enough to protect it?
And what if they're not? What happens then?
That's when you have to come up with supplementary measures. Basically, you're adding extra layers of protection to make up for the difference, like maybe stronger encryption or tighter access controls. You could even mask the data so it doesn't look like real data anymore.
So you're going above and beyond what's in the contract just to be safe, especially if that other country doesn't have the same level of protection as the GDPR.
Exactly. It shows that you're serious about data protection, and you're trying to reduce risks no matter where the data goes.
This is all really thorough, but there's one thing I'm still kind of stuck on. What happens if a processor is forced by a law in another country to handle data in a way that you didn't tell them to? What happens when the laws clash?
Oh yeah, that's a really important point. And it brings us to this unless clause in Article 28 of the GDPR. It's pretty interesting, and it has some people worried.
Okay, so what is the unless clause, and why is everyone making such a big deal about it?
Right, so Article 28 is all about the contract between you, the controller, and your processor. It says, basically, your processor has to follow your instructions when processing data. Makes sense, right?
Yep.
But then, and here's where that unless comes in, they can ignore those instructions if they're legally obligated to by EU law or the law of an EU member state.
So it's like an exception to the rule, but why is that such a big deal, especially with these international transfers?
Well, the problem is that some contracts, they use broader language for that exception. Instead of just saying EU law, they're saying unless required by any law or order from a government. And that government could be anywhere.
So a foreign government could force a processor to turn over data, even if it goes against your instructions and maybe even violates GDPR.
That's the worry. And it makes you wonder, whose laws actually matter here? And are these contracts actually weakening the GDPR's protections?
It's like opening a can of worms. So what does the EDPB say about all this? Do they say these broader contracts are a no-go?
You know, they don't actually condemn them outright. They say that just having this broader exception in your contract doesn't automatically mean you're breaking the GDPR. But, and this is important, they do say that just because a processor is legally obligated by another country, that doesn't mean they can ignore the GDPR. And neither can you, the controller.
So it's like a gray area. You can have these contracts, but they don't give you a free pass to forget about the GDPR if a foreign government comes knocking.
Yes, that's it exactly.
Mhm.
And the opinion really emphasizes doing your homework. Don't just assume you're safe because you've got a signed contract. You have to be aware of these potential conflicts, understand those other countries' laws, and think about extra safeguards.
Don't wait for the problem to happen before you start figuring out a solution, right?
Exactly. And that proactive thinking, it should be everywhere. Your contracts, your data transfer assessments, your whole data protection plan, it's all connected.
This has been really eye-opening. But before we get too deep into international transfers, let's talk about what this all means for our listeners. What are the key things to remember from this opinion?
So what I'm hearing is, with this unless clause, the most important thing is to know those laws could clash. Do your research and make sure you're okay with the risk. It's not about just trusting the contract. It's about understanding what it all really means.
That's it. This opinion really drives home a key point. Your accountability doesn't end at the border, and it doesn't go away just because you've hired a processor. At the end of the day, you're the data controller. You're the one responsible for that data, no matter where it goes or who's processing it.
It's a lot to handle,
Mm.
especially because data privacy rules seem to change all the time. So, as someone building products, does this make you rethink how you approach these international partnerships? It really does.
Yeah.
It makes you realize how important it is to bake data protection into your product right from the start. Like, if you could just collect less data in the first place or use technology that protects privacy from day one, that already solves a lot of these problems.
Being proactive, not waiting for the fire to start before you find the fire extinguisher.
Right. And that goes for everything. Who you pick as your processors and sub-processors, how you write your contracts, how you do those transfer impact assessments. It's all connected.
I love that. This has been a fascinating deep dive into, let's be honest, the sometimes confusing world of data privacy. Hopefully you have a better idea now of what it means to be a data controller, especially when it comes to those data processing chains. They can get complicated.
And remember, the rules are always changing, so be curious, stay informed, and don't be afraid to ask questions.
We've got a whole bunch of other episodes about data privacy, security, all that good stuff. Join us next time for another deep dive. Until then, stay curious.